Hello, my name is Maria Schmitz. Today I'd like to continue with Jamaican Tales by Alecia McKenzie with a whole lot of background. Post-colonial literature has long since been classic. In the Italian Afterword of Jamaican Tales, Racconti Giamaicani, Patrizia Villani writes, "In fact, the illustrious antecedents of Alecia McKenzie's lively characters belong to the same world as the stories of Eric Waldron's Tropic Death in the everyday reality of the inhabitants of Naipaul's Miguel Street, and take us back to the tragicomic events of those lonely Londoners, of whom Sam Selvon gave us an unforgettable portrait against the backdrop of a society, European and Caribbean, afflicted by the scourge of colonialism and racism, and described with bitter irony also in George Lemming's essay, The Pleasures of Exile." The short story soon became a fundamental form of literary expression for Caribbean writers, starting with the generation that wrote its masterpieces in the 1950s and 60s. In the last 2 decades in particular, there has been talk of a female new wave as women occupy the central stage of this literature, and authors such as Olive Senior, Jamaica Kincaid, Pauline Melville, Makeda Silvera, and Alecia McKenzie currently represented and still represent a driving force behind contemporary Caribbean literature. I have already introduced you to Olive Senior's Hurricane Watch and Pandemic Poems, and Alecia McKenzie's A Million Aunties on this channel. In the stories of these writers, the vitality of the language and the modernity of the overall tone and the psychology of the characters, especially the female characters who are always fully characterized, are the main features of this extremely vital literature. The short story seems to be particularly congenial to the dense and immediately perceptible reality of the region because it allows the depiction of small epiphanies that lead to the protagonists recognizing themselves. This is reminiscent of what Denis Scheck has to say about the purpose of literature, and they also lead to the representation of a microcosm that gives the strong and precise sensation of real, tangible, overpowering, everyday life. Another crucial factor that has always imbued the very structure of this literature is that of emigration, a phenomenon endemic in the Caribbean since the 1930s and still active in determining and shaping the social reality of the archipelago. Patrizia Villani continues, "We have spoken of diaspora and exile, which must be considered 2 sides of the same coin. An experience of constrained and violent migration linked to slavery. The diaspora of the African population is a phenomenon that has been historically documented, described and studied, and which has left perhaps indelible and psychological traces in the history of the New World, and in particular in the Caribbean islands, whose multi-ethnic and multicultural society is its conscious but not resigned or docile child. Exile, a modern and seemingly voluntary version of this diaspora, constitutes the closest reality. The current reasons for this emigration are almost exclusively economic and sometimes political, for most people finding work or escaping a situation of lack of freedom. But in the case of intellectuals, artists and writers, they are mainly due to this physiological search for a more organic and satisfying cultural environment. Their common bond being the strong sense of belonging to the Caribbean world, which never wanes and forms a solid, radical apparatus that indissolubly binds these cosmopolitan exiles to the rich humus of the archipelago, even if they reside permanently abroad. Indeed, as is often the case, it is precisely this geographical distance that allows these authors to psychologically process and focus with extreme precision, and a passion in which nostalgia seems to play a fundamental role, on their first-hand experiences and the human and social landscape of the islands. And this becomes precisely the fundamental theme underlying the stories of Alecia McKenzie, a Jamaican writer of the latest generation who, after having lived in Belgium, London and Singapore, has personally experienced this condition common to a large part of the Caribbean population. Alecia McKenzie well represents the new generation of writers who relentlessly explore the recent history and reality of their country. Through observation and a faithful description of human relationships, an ideal backdrop to highlight hypocrisies, conflicts and lack of commitment in contemporary, Jamaican in this case, society. This writer moves away from the traditional themes of slavery and colonialism that have been dealt with by the previous generation of West Indian writers and examines the new ills of her home country with a simple, incisive style and vision, dealing with conflicts between generations, the expectations of young people in the social and political spheres, gender equality, and everyday problems of class, wealth, and poverty. In this literature, the links between power, politics, and language, in this case Creole and Standard English, are at the center of a picture in which the role of the artist in the community and the desire to create a new and equitable society in which to sink one's roots again and more firmly, without erasing the past from collective memory, constitute the pillars of a contemporary vision of the reality of the West Indies, shared also by more mature writers such as Jamaica Kincaid and Derek Walcott, who in his recent poem, Tipolo's Hound, specifically investigates the Caribbean artist's painful relationship with the society that generated him and with the European tradition, a necessary inheritance but one laden with painful memories. In almost all the short stories in the present collection, Jamaican Tales, emigration is a common phenomenon for the characters who are themselves exiles or know someone who has moved to Europe or the United States for various reasons, or speak of those who would like to leave for that world considered a liberation from a dead-end reality, or of those who return occasionally or punctually to the islands for a holiday or to see relatives or friends again. They describe life on the islands or the atmosphere that reigns there, with the emotional ambivalence typical of fundamental human passions, a love-hate that betrays the depth of attachment to one's homeland and nostalgia for the landscapes, people, smells, colors, and finally the food itself, which in its typicality and maternal function of nourishment, warmth and sharing, represents the simplest and most everyday link with tradition and family. Another often painful topic, inextricably linked to the problem of social precariousness and emigration, is that of the family, or rather the often disjointed or simply single-parent structure that traditionally constitutes the typical family unit in these cultures. The family is almost always the mother or the grandmother, fundamental figures who alone, fathers seem eternally absent in this tradition, are responsible for raising and educating children and grandchildren, taking on a difficult economic and psychological task in a society in which marriage and the male presence are fluctuating and temporary notions, without solidity and substance, experiences that are rather the exception to the rule of obligatory matriarchy and hitherto shared by almost the entire population. And when men do appear in this reality, it is all too often to demonstrate their own weaknesses, violence, inability to form lasting relationships, infidelity, or to show that they are no match for the unscrupulous and courageous female figures who populate the narrative, solid and passionate in their individual identities. Central in this regard seems to be the short story As Harsh as Guinnep, which emblematically incorporates all the themes tackled by the author and reproposes in the complicated life of the protagonist and in her family ties the range of experiences that most probably characterize the everyday existence of most sleepers and young people in the Caribbean. In the account of these experiences, recounted in the first person by the protagonist, the passion, bitterness, and yet courage of those who do not resign themselves to obstacles and difficulties shine through, despite the sobriety and calmness of the narrator's voice. In the other stories, from time to time tender, tragic, or humorous, the themes touched upon are the unstable social and political situation, emigration and violence on the islands, the experience of school, the ambiguous relationship with teachers, and the importance of a higher education for a different life. And finally, the question of life away from the islands, the problem of racism and solidarity in the delicate story Dance of Exile, for instance, whose highly significant title could frame the entire collection, according to Patrizia Villani. Above all, the illuminating attention that Alecia McKenzie and the other writers of this fascinating archipelago continue to shine like a spotlight on that particular reality that none of them can or will do without, because it is the vital core of creative experience and writing that the Caribbean artist, writer, or poet must draw upon to survive and grow, to realize his or her vision in the world.